to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. Folks could let me know in the chat whether I'm coming through okay. Today we are going to be discussing Brazil, the kind of extraordinary Brazilian election that we have just experienced, and why it makes me very hopeful. And why I actually believe, this is sort of evolving as we go on, why I believe that what Brazil is doing, as I've dived in on Brazil over the past weekend, not as an expert at all, I think what Brazil is doing presents a much more potentially successful method of coping with U.S. empire than anything that China or obviously Russia is doing. I think it's a really interesting case of democratic development, a place where more freedom is being developed in some very real ways. And of course, as promised by the branding of this video, we'll talk a little bit about why Brazil, by the standards of U.S. discourse, is so much more Russia-friendly than is acceptable to talk about in U.S. and European media. Specifically why both Lula and Bolsonaro, the contestants in this election that shook out on Sunday, are both pretty Russia curious. Before we get into it, let me double check, make sure that I'm here. Okay, I'm coming through okay, that's good. If you're new here, you may see the live chat to the right. I don't have the mental bandwidth to both present and engage with the chat. We do have a few rules here. We allow a pretty wide range of discussion. Go crazy, you can say pretty much anything you want about the issues at hand, as long as it's not too flagrantly genocidal. But we do ask, you're also free, encouraged, in fact, to say anything you want about me, my stupid haircut, how little I know about the topic at hand. Go nuts. What we do require is that you be civil to other people in the chat, that you not attack other people in the chat, and also that you not be disruptive of the chat. I do not have the time to moderate, but Logo Cool Extreme has kindly stepped up, as he does every month, as the moderator. And if he determines that you're being disruptive or breaking the rules that I laid out in some way, then he will warn you. And if you don't listen to his warning, he will then block you. There is no appeal from the court of Loga. If he says you're gone for good. So do what he says. Also, please hold off on any super chats or whatnot until we get into the Q&A period. I'm going to be sort of blathering on about Brazil in a presentation that'll last for half hour, 45 minutes. It's a country that I know very little about, so it'll probably last less long than others. And then we'll just do Q&A for the balance of the 2 hours. That's how things work here. And then for the Q&A, I'll dive into the chat and answer as many questions as I can. First off, what happened? Well, I think first off, actually, the most important thing to say first is how wrong I was. I got this wrong. That happens very rarely here. And especially rarely, I'm ecstatic that I got this wrong. For Brazil is not country that I cover much on this channel. They're lucky enough to not have active conflict. They're lucky enough in that the United States is not directly intervening in their politics at the moment. So I don't cover it very much. I have read a couple long reads over the years, and I follow politics there. I'm aware of the basics, but I've never done a video on it or what have you. But I've really... my one thing that I've said that seemed just kind of obvious to me, and I've pointed out in live streams, patrons-only chats on the Discord for 6 months now, what I've been saying is, gee whiz, Lula had better win by 10-15%, because if he doesn't win by 10-15%, then he's, then this Bolsonaro character, he's definitely going to do a coup, because that's just the kind of country that Brazil is, and that's the kind of character that Bolsonaro is, and This assumption of mine was born out of my experience in Turkey, where Erdogan does screw with elections, but sort of at the margins. He can steal an election if it's a question of a percent or two, or a percent or two or five. He can't if it's a question of 20%, as we saw in some local elections in Turkey a couple of years back. Um, so that's what I said. I said, "Oh no, Brazil is shaky. Bolsonaro, he's a bad actor. If Lula doesn't win by 20%, then we're going to see a coup." This is what I was saying for 6 months, and it appears. I mean, it's only Tuesday. There's still plenty of time, but it appears from Bolsonaro's actions after losing the Brazilian presidential election on Sunday, Bolsonaro seems to just sort of be knuckling under. His allies don't seem to be talking much about coups. Brazil's elites seem to be reconciling themselves to Lula, and that's just extraordinary because Lula did not win by 10, 15% or 20%. I think there were actual polls. I don't know if there are any polls where he was hitting 20%, but over the past year or so, there were polls where he was definitely winning by 10, 15%. He did not win by much at all. I think he ended up winning by about 2 million votes, which in a country of 215 million people is not very much. It was a small margin. This is exactly the kind of margin that I believe, in Turkey, Erdogan would try to steal. And this is a much smaller margin than uh, Trump did attempt to steal. And Bolsonaro, it's interesting. I've seen a lot of people mocking Bolsonaro for being like, haha, you're a weakling, for not doing a coup. It's like, actually, this is Bolsonaro is a better Democrat than anybody in the US Republican Party. Um, that's something that needs to be said. Bolsonaro probably, I'm sure, if Bolsonaro thought he had the backing he needed, we'll talk about why he doesn't. The backing he needed among the Brazilian elites and the international community, then yeah, he'd totally be doing a coup right now. I'm not saying that Bolsonaro's a particularly virtuous guy, but he is making a virtuous choice, and I think he should be applauded for it rather than mocked. I think some folks in the comments on my shorts that I've had mentioned about this are kind of misunderstanding why I'm so excited about this result. I think they're sort of assuming that I'm falling into like sort of standard left wing and also surprisingly large center left in the U.S. Just sort of Lula swooning, Lula standing. Um, this is not an election that Lula won, really. Like the story of this election, honestly, the story from my perspective of the 2020 election as well, is of the right doing extraordinarily better than expected. There were polls that people took seriously that talked about Lula winning by 10, 15% in this election. He only won by 1 or 2%. Well, actually, less than a percent. I don't know. I haven't done the math. I'm not a math guy. Not a math guy. But he did not lose by. He did not win by very much. And the results in the both houses, I believe, of the Brazilian Congress are also not were also not that exciting for Lula and his folks. They were not that exciting for the left wing. This is not a left wing victory in Brazil. What this is, and what I'm excited about, is a victory for democracy. Bolsonaro, his party, the Bolsonaristas, or what have you, remain a massively important part of Brazilian politics. This is not like any kind of ending. This is not any kind of dominating victory for anybody. What this is this is a victory for democracy. Is it possible that Bolsonaro would not have been um, uh, as willing to knuckle under and just let the presidential election happen if his party hadn't been so successful? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's some truth to that. But it is fascinating. Like this is an election that is much closer than the 2020 election in the United States. Biden won by 7 or 8 million votes or something like that. Lula only won by two. Yeah, if you do the proportions, so I guess like uh, the United States is like about 50% larger than Brazil, so or something along those lines. But still, even if you incorporate the population measures, this is a much closer election, and Brazil survived it. I think it's also important to talk about the quality of Brazilian democracy. I ran a video this morning, sort of intentionally um, contentious, talking about how, wow, Brazil is now more civilized than the United States. It has a better democratic, its most recent democratic transition is better than the United States' most recent democratic transition. And I think there's also elements of Brazilian democracy that, as I've looked into it again, this is quite amateurish, just over the past couple days, as I've been delving into the stories around this election, is it's kind of fascinating the way that Brazilian democracy seems to be a lot more responsive to the needs of the Brazilian public. Like it's just like imagine that. Now this is portrayed in the United States media. This is portrayed as um, this is portrayed as corrupt. This is portrayed as like really kind of shitty democracy, or like, oh, they're all just buying votes. It's interesting because I was listening to a left wing podcast last night and talking about the election. And Lula is known as a staggeringly successful president of Brazil. He did extraordinarily well. Inequality fell. The economy grew. He was president, I think, from 2004 to 2010. Is that correct? Time that is remembered as a just really just great time for Brazil generally. A time when Brazilian promise was finally being realized. Now, there are reasons why Lula was able to be that successful, specifically around what was happening in commodities markets and the world economy. It's not like Lula was just some sort of genius, and if people are expecting a return to the early century golden age, they are most likely going to be disappointed. But what's interesting about the thing that everybody who reads the news knows about his success and how he was so effective at minimizing inequality was the fact that he put money directly towards poor people. He gave money to poor people. It was called the Bolsa Familia program. And if you've read an article about Brazilian politics in the past 10 years, you've read about Bolsa Familia and its successes. What was so interesting is I was listening to a left wing podcast that was complaining about Bolsonaro and how Bolsonaro had closed the polls, and why Bolsonaro had overperformed. And they were like, God damn it, Bolsonaro was giving money. He was paying for votes. He was giving out money to poor people. And it's interesting to me that there seems to be a kind of arms race in Brazilian politics as to which populist party, left wing or right wing, can improve the lives of their people more. And that's a superior democracy to the United States. That's just true. That's just better and more civilized than what the United States has been doing for the past 40 years. What the United States has been doing, we have been to um, competing between political parties to see who can spend more money on military equipment. That's the main growth area in U.S. public expenditure for no value. It's key to point this out, for no value. People are absolutely right that we spend less on the Pentagon than we spend on Medicare and Social Security. These are programs that are 50 to 80 years old. It's true, but the only new thing that we've done in the 40 years since Ronald Reagan came to power, the only new activity that the U.S. government has engaged in, new programs, new changes, new things that they spend money on, are murdering 1 million people in the Middle East, and just generally failing and losing wars. That's what we've pissed $6 trillion away on. That's what the democratic system in the United States has produced over the past 40 years. Over the past 2 decades, under two very different styles of leaders, the Brazilian democratic system has produced a competition to give money to poor people. That's a lot better than the United States. That's kind of extraordinary. Now, could this be done better? Could this be done officially? Yes, is that parallel that I made there between Bolsa Familia, which is my understanding is a somewhat rigorously put together program, and Bolsonaro fire hosing money at people in the 3 weeks before an election. Obviously, those are different things, but broadly, these two elements, the two dominant elements in the very, very complicated Brazilian political scene, are competing to help poor people. Um, that's a much better, more civilized, more democratic political system than the United States. In the United States, we're incredibly blessed that thanks to the New Deal, thanks to the Great Society, um, and not just Democrats. I mean, Republicans were very competent administrators of these programs prior to the 1980s as well. Um, we have this infrastructure of social provision in the United States that works very well. But what we've had in the past 40 years from the Republicans and Democrats is a competition to take them away from the US public. Thankfully, thank God for the AARP, the American Association of Retired People, the most powerful lobby in the United States. Thanks to them, we haven't, the Democrats and Republicans that have been competing, chomping at the bit to dismantle more of the U.S. Just social safety net, have failed largely. I mean, Medicare and Social Security still exist and are still largely publicly run, though there has been some really troubling inroads into Medicare, our healthcare program for seniors, by the private sector. But yeah, so I mean, Brazil is just a better democracy than the United States. It does more for its people. The issues that they are discussing are real. Now, Brazil, of course, requires people to vote. It's an obligation, so it's unfair to compare the voter participation in Brazil to the voter participation in the United States, where you're not legally required to vote. But I can see why the Brazilians are more interested in voting if there weren't those legal differences, because it's real. There's real benefits that are provided by these political parties, and of course, from the airy heights of the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal editorial pages, we look down on this dirty, sordid Brazilian democracy where politicians actually compete to provide benefits for the peoples of their countries. We sort of look down on that quite snootily. And I don't know, man. The past weekend, I've been looking at that and been pretty impressive. Of course, Brazilian politics is corrupt in ways that are really unpleasant, and they should do serious work on. They do have anti-corruption stuff, anti-corruption efforts that they take. Some of them get massively politicized, which is how we got Lula briefly convicted of corruption. But obviously, Brazil is not on the same level of the United States in terms of wealth, in terms of the peacefulness of their politics. A lot of assassinations that go on, a lot of thuggery, a lot of intimidation. But it is kind of interesting because Brazil is, some of the less savory aspects of Brazilian electioneering are probably things that we could see in the United States. in this decade. Will we see police officers, local sheriffs and whatnot, becoming more intimidating of Democratic voters? Will we see violence at the polls? Will we see just larger scale of political violence, like, oh, I don't know, an attempted assassination against Nancy Pelosi, which we saw last week? Yeah, I think we're gonna see more of those, nasty Brazilian elements to the politics. I mean, interestingly, maybe as U.S. politics begin to matter more, because I think that I'm not sure the Democrats and Republicans have wised up to it yet, but the next step in U.S. politics is figuring out the right way to give money to poor people. Because the past 40 years, what U.S. politics has been about, what world politics has been about through U.S. power, has been about trying to give more money to rich people. It has been, I think part of this is like legitimate to some extent. I think there are parts of the economy that are better run by the private sector. There is, I think it's likely that by the 1970s, too many governments in too many places, not just socialist ones, had moved too far in an anti-market direction. I think that's totally true. And I think in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, there were valuable reforms that were to be made, valuable, such as tax cuts, such as deregulatory efforts. That was great. I think we reached the point of diminishing returns by the late 90s and the point of like actual malice and damage to the world and U.S. economy, certainly by 2008 and probably before. So like I think that in a negative sense, I think we're going to see the kinds of darker elements that we saw in this Brazilian election, local police forces, acting as sort of Gestapo for one side or the other, presumably more for Republicans. Violence. We're probably going to see more of that in the next decade in the United States. But we're also likely to see Brazil is also ahead in a positive sense because it's time now for the other 80% of Americans to benefit a little bit from government. For the past, my entire lifetime, since 1980, the main thing that the US government has been about is finding ways to give more money to rich people, to help the top 20%. Not just through tax cuts, but also through, sort of essentially giveaways. Like the whole like student loan industry, like it's an industry that does not need to exist. Like the government is more than capable of lending out that money at a lower interest rate. But we just created these companies out of nowhere and gave them a government guarantee. The entire $6 trillion defense industry, $6 trillion over the past 20 years or so, like that's all just giveaways to rich people. That's because obviously it isn't doing anything worthwhile for the United States or the U.S. public. So like that's all that the U.S. government has done for the past 20 years is just giveaways for rich people for the past 40 years. The fact that Brazilian politics seems to be very rooted in giving money to the public actually makes it kind of a forerunner of where the U.S. is heading. So I'm saying not only is Brazil currently more civilized and democratic than the United States, I'm saying that U.S. politicians have a lot to learn from not just Lula, but also from Bolsonaro. That's what I'm saying. That is my honest opinion, actually. So yeah, this is not like some like uncritical, Lula love fest. Like I've actually looked into this, and I think that on a lot of metrics, like Brazil has a better political system than the United States at this point. That's which is actually kind of an optimistic statement because it would actually be so easy to improve things. What's kind of interesting on this Brazil topic is looking into why Bolsonaro lost the support. It was very clear that Bolsonaro was going to be a embarrassing political figure when he was elected in 2018. Half of Rob's talking is That makes me sad. It was very clear that Bolsonaro was a monstrous person in 2018. Regardless, he had the backing of not just rich people in Brazil, but the backing of a worldwide coalition of thinkers and just basically pro elite, pro money forces. The Economist, I think, is the most egregious example of this. It's a great news magazine out of the UK. Okay, great. I don't know. I've read it for years and years and years. Read it to cover to cover as a 20-something, and have since fallen out of love with it. One of the reasons I've fallen out of love with it was how enthusiastically they backed Bolsonaro. The reason that all of these forces backed Bolsonaro and were so excited about Bolsonaro is because they had a particular reform of the Brazilian pension system that they expected Bolsonaro to do. This was something that Lula and his successor from his party, Dilma, were obviously going to shy away from. They're from the Workers' Party, a traditionally left-centered group of folks, so they were not going to lessen a pension system. They were not going to cut down on pensions in favor of a neoliberal elite finance industry payday. The reason that The Economist supported Bolsonaro, the reason why a lot more traditionally dignified and tasteful Brazilian elites supported Bolsonaro was because they thought that this fascist thug was going to do their bidding and was going to privatize, massively privatize the Brazilian pension system. I'm not sure if it was just public sector or on a broader scale. He was going to be their guy. He was going to do this reform that the IMF wanted, that The Economist wanted, that every article I've read in The Economist for the past 20 years talking about Brazil has been talking about, oh, something must be done about this pension system. Because if something is done about this pension system, if it is privatized, then it is a massive pool of money that is given to bank managers. Like your 401k, if you live in the United States and you have a privately administered pension program. It's not a pension program. A 401k is an account, a set sum of money that you put your money in there, and then it is privately administered, and you can invest in the stock market. One of the reasons why the U.S. stock market has gone so insane over the past 30 years is because public pensions, because the idea that a company or public agency that you work for would owe you some money that has been replaced by your private 401k. You only have as much money as you put in there and how it does on investment markets. That's all privately administered. That means that somebody in Wall Street gets a small take of your 401k. It's a small take of whatever mutual fund you purchase. That is the reason why elites in Brazil and worldwide supported Bolsonaro, because he was going to do that for them. He was going to take the retirements of a country of 215 million people that was becoming dramatically richer in the first decade of this century and was going to give that to Wall Street. I don't know what the Brazilian equivalent of Wall Street is, but international Wall Street, because those funds, whether they're directly administered by US or international banks or not, even if it was just moving into a Brazilian private sector version, it all just greases the worldwide system. So this is what The Economist wanted. This is what Brazilian elites who endorsed Bolsonaro wanted. And Bolsonaro didn't give it to him because Bolsonaro had to get reelected. And the much more engaged Brazilian public could see that this was largely a scam. Now, I'm not saying that Brazil's pension systems, whether public sector or larger, I probably should have gone into a little more detail on this if I was going to talk about it at this length. It doesn't mean that they aren't unsustainable. It doesn't mean that there aren't serious reforms that need to be made to that pension system. That doesn't necessarily mean that could very well be true, but that doesn't mean that the only solution is to just give all that money to Wall Street. And it's interesting to me that neither the left wing nor the right wing populist parties felt that they were capable of giving this massive handout to elites that the international and local elites wanted. And that is yet another indication that Brazil's just a better democracy than the United States. I think, again, that's just sort of a fact. Even Bolsonaro has to act more in accordance with the wishes of the Brazilian public, or the interests of the Brazilian public, than any U.S. politician has. I think that's really interesting. And I don't know, okay, I wouldn't go as far as to say there's no question, but I think it's very likely that Bolsonaro would have had the wherewithal to pull off a coup of some sort if he had made these reforms that the economists and Wall Street and worldwide rich people wanted him to make. Would he have been able to win an come this close to winning an election? Maybe not. So I think what we have in Brazil right now is a rude democracy. Rude in the sense of rude health. It is scary in a lot of ways. It is violent more often than anybody would want. It is definitely corrupt in ways that it would be better if it could work further away from. But this isn't some massive left-wing victory or some final answer or question or solution. No, this is Brazil consolidating its democracy. This is a tremendously contentious election that everybody expected to be a real disaster and potentially a democracy-ending disaster. People thought seriously that the sixth Brazilian Republic was only going to last from 1985 to 2022. That was a serious possibility. Bolsonaro talked about it being a serious possibility. And the fact that that's not the case, and that Brazil continues to be as democratic as it is in ways that the United States is not, and gets to struggle through to the next day, next month, next what have you, is really cool. And Lula is almost certainly going to end up with his reputation tarnished here. Again, folks who think this is some kind of striking left-wing victory are incorrect. This is a victory for democracy. Brazil is in a rough position. It's going to continue to be in a rough position. It's going to, the kinds of accommodations that are going to have to be made by Lula to get anything done with the Congress that he's facing. Who knows? I mean, Lula might have to do some kind of pension reform to get anything done. So, yeah, this is not some massive left-wing victory. This is not a final solution to any problem. This is not a victory over Bolsonarismo. Like, the Bolsonaro forces did very well. They won important governorships. They are much more powerful in the Congress than was expected. Brazil, I don't want to go quite this far. I don't know enough about Brazil to say this, but I suspect that Brazil has a more real, less corrupt political scene than it ever has had. No, I could be completely wrong about this. I don't know enough about Brazil to say this, but my understanding about Brazilian democracy since 1985 is, just sort of glancing at it, is it's your standard better than dictatorship for sure, elite-driven, technocratic democracy, a real democracy, that just sort of muddled along for a while. Then Lula, the advent of Lula in 2000 or so, thereabouts, 2004, 2006, thereabouts, was a left-wing thunderclap. I mean, this is a guy who was tortured by the dictatorship, a guy who had to moderate somewhat to become president, but was very rabidly left-wing. Then we've had Bolsonaro since 2018, who's rabidly right-wing in a really troubling sense. But both of these elements that now appear to be the most powerful elements in Brazilian politics represent real factions, real alternatives, real approaches in ways that the Democrats and the Republicans in the United States certainly do not. And if that Brazilian politics, this I got from a very long Perry Anderson read I did a couple of years back, has been about quite corrupt, quite nasty horse trading. And I feel like a system where the Bolsonaro and Lula parties are dominant and competing against each other is certainly also going to be corrupt or whatnot, but I think it's plausible, I'm not saying this is absolutely the case, it's plausible that it could be significantly less corrupt and more centered on delivering real benefits to the Brazilian public than what we had in the 80s and 90s, or certainly than what we had when Dilma was forced out under Michel Temer. Is that how I pronounce that? Anyway, so, okay, that's sort of what I have to say about Brazilian politics. Take with a grain of salt that I am not at all expert on this. I've just sort of followed Brazil as a news consumer like any of you, and have over the past couple of days and in earlier months and years have sat down to read a couple long reads and dive in a little bit deeper. So yeah, I'm optimistic about Brazil. And to take it to sort of geopolitics, I'm optimistic about Brazil setting itself up as a democracy that is this strong. Because I think Brazil's focus, what they have the potential to do right, is something that the Chinese used to do so well, which was, we're just going to focus on ourselves, we're going to figure out our own stuff. And I think both Bolsonaro and Lula's forays into international politics are interesting because they have more freedom. They have a sort of independence that a lot of other countries simply don't. I think one of the central question of this, why Brazil loves China or whatnot, or why does why Brazil loves Russia? Why is Brazil capable of being so much more Russia positive than most other countries in the world? Is simply that it can. I think that many more countries in the world, if they had their choice, would be not necessarily openly siding with Russia, but they would be a lot less tolerant of the US's framing of this issue. And I think that's the best way to describe what both Bolsonaro and Lula were, which is intolerant of US framing of this issue. Because as Brazil, a country that has been independent for 2 centuries now, or did they become independent from Portugal significantly later? I may or may not be wrong about that. That sticks in my head that Brazil might have become independent from Portugal later than most of the other Latin American countries became independent from Spain. But I should know that. I'm embarrassed. But regardless, they've been independent for 150 years, but they've had to deal with very serious imperial oversight, first from the British and now from the Americans. And they recognize what we've done in Ukraine. Like, it is a very successful imperial effort called divide and conquer. Through most of the 20th century, Ukraine and Russia were in the same country. Even for the early decades of Ukrainian independence, Ukrainians were pretty positive towards Russia. The United States and the European Union, to a lesser extent, through the creation of a series of marquee events, managed to divide. And people are like, oh man, they think it's like some kind of big winner when you're like, you know, the Revolution of Dignity in 2014 wasn't about NATO, it was about the EU, as if the EU is some kind of independent entity when it comes to US power projection. So what the United States has done, and having, now that we are past the US installed prime minister and president of Ukraine, past Poroshenko, who was after that guy, I can't remember his name, that set, who I also wasn't particularly sympathetic to. I am very sympathetic to Zelensky. I think the United States has successfully created a nation in a very real way, in a very successful strategy of divide and conquer that has completely beclowned the Russians. Yeah, the Russians lost. They're big frickin' losers, and the U.S. did that to them, and we should be fairly proud of that. I guess we should be fairly proud of that. But from the context of Brazil, folks who have been on the receiving end of U.S. imperial policies, uh, they're not super psyched about that. And I think that's the case for vastly more people in the world than we are currently talking about. I think there was was it in the recent days? There was a Cambridge, I mean, that was about China opinions, not Russia China opinions specifically, but I do think there's probably some transmissibility. Like, vastly more of the world remembers imperial efforts and remembers that, yeah, to an extent, obviously nowhere near to the extent as indicated in their propaganda, the Soviets were anti-imperial actors, were supporting independence movements. So I think that for the Brazilians, as with a lot of the global South, they look at what the United States has done to Russia and Ukraine with a lot more of a jaded eye. It doesn't mean they're pro-Russia invading places, but they have a much better historical sense of what's going on here than most of the U.S. commentariat. Which is why you have, I should have put a link in the description, maybe I will after the fact. Bolsonaro was quite explicit in supporting Russia on a few occasions. He only went so far, but he did go in some direction. Lula, in an interview, was it May or was it even more recently than that, talking about, okay, Putin shouldn't have invaded, but let's be clear here, Ukraine has also taken actions that are belligerent, this, that, and the other thing, which people have been tweeting over the past 48 hours, just outraged and horrified that someone could be so honest about what's been going on between Russia and Ukraine. And the reason why Brazil is able to have two fiercely competing members of their political class who both are kind of, I mean, to be clear, Lula is not as pro-Russia as Bolsonaro is, but that they largely kind of have a similar read on what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. The fact that they can have that, the fact that in the many, many votes in the UN, it's always interesting, the votes in the UN General Assembly around condemning differing aspects of Russia. It would be the work of a week to actually analyze those votes. There's been a half dozen votes related to Russia's invasion of Ukraine now. Each resolution says different things on how a country deals with that. But by and large, there is a consistent pattern that emerges. There are certain countries, Brazil, India, China, I think a few others, that will either vote in favor of Russia or will simply abstain. And they're pretty standout, and Brazil is one of those. India is one of those. And the reason why Brazil is able to act in sympathy to Russia is very similar to the reason that India can act in sympathy to Russia in these very symbolic ways, is because they're big enough that they can do it. Because Brazil and India are large enough, have enough economic weight that they can make those open stances of just sort of mild disapproval of the US enforced hegemonic approach to the issue. They can do that without being destroyed. I ran a video, how I think Yemen versus the Cold War, a couple months back, that talked about what can happen if you're a small country that votes against U.S. interests, Yemen, there's a lot of reasons why Yemen is a terribly poor country, but there was a period in the 70s and 80s where it kind of looked like it was doing okay. And far worse than 9/11, far worse than Saudi Arabia's initial invasion, the point at which Yemen's development was derailed for the 30 years that have followed was when they voted against U.S. interests at the United Nations. Now that was a bigger deal than the General Assembly. They were in the Security Council. That was significant. But you can seriously lose your power. You can lose your ability to have a functioning economy if you vote against the United States in one of these international forums. That's what happened to Yemen in 1990. And I think that most people voting in those General Assembly uh, elections on resolutions about Ukraine and Russia, even as toothless as they are, know that the United States has that power, could just decide to destroy them because we had been, because we don't like a vote that they made. Brazil and India, South Africa to a degree, are places that are systemically important enough to the U.S. economy, have enough population, have enough natural resources, have enough oomph to them generally that they're allowed, that the United States isn't going to crush them over a General Assembly vote. And they know that the United States isn't going to crush them over a General Assembly vote. So why does Brazil love Russia? Because it's big and powerful enough to be able to um, be able to exhibit mild dissent without getting absolutely crushed by the United States. So to answer the question and justify the fact that I put Russia in the thumbnail here. Okay, I think that is everything I have to say in my presentation. I hope that was worthwhile, even though I'm not much of a Brazil expert. Thank you, Eric Hoel, for the super chat. What is an NOK? I don't know what country that is. Cool subject. What do you think this victory means for the democratic world, if any? I think it's good. And as I hope I emphasized today, it's that now I'm not like Lula is objectively, by most measures, a better person than Bolsonaro, and his politics are better. That is absolutely true. But as I hope I emphasized today, it's not just about like, ooh, wahoo, Lula, Lula, Lula. It is the fact that the Brazilian system has survived a very harsh test of its democracy and will continue to move forward with Bolsonaro and Lula elements battling it out to see who can do a better job of serving the Brazilian public. So I think that leaving aside the character of Lula, which I do believe to be better than that of Bolsonaro, this sort of like Wall Street Journal opinion page line that's like, oh, Lula's savagely corrupt compared to Bolsonaro is just flatulent nonsense. What he is that the Wall Street Journal opinion page hates is he is much more openly left wing than Bolsonaro. Though Bolsonaro is, with his reluctance to do pension reform, is probably more openly left wing than the U.S. Democratic Party. So there's that. So yeah, that. So I think it's. I hope, Eric, that I've adequately answered that question in the presentation. But just to reiterate, I believe that Brazil's democracy has impressed. It has shown itself to have a vigorous, serious, world-class democracy that the United States has a lot to learn from. And I think it's just nice to see some good news. Over the past decade, I've watched the Trump nightmare come barreling down over the course of a year. These slow motion disasters where you're like, oh, this couldn't possibly, this is the worst thing that could happen. Won't happen. Trump won't be elected. And just to watch it just happen, and then happen. And the same thing with Brexit. This just sort of stuff that, oh, this couldn't possibly, and then it happened. And it's really nice because this was another widely telegraphed disaster, Bolsonaro ending Brazilian democracy, and it just didn't happen. Yet, I mean, who knows? Maybe in the 2 hours since in the hour since I started this presentation, maybe it's wrong and he has. But so far, it seems like Brazilian democracy is going to survive, and that's amazing. So yeah, it's a very good thing. We're now open for super chats. I will answer any questions from super chats, but others. Um, ba, 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 ba. Hello, Christopher. Questions. Um, do we have questions? I don't see the Baltics on the same capacity. Do we have questions? Do we have questions on TikTok? Do you think Trump will get elected again? I think it's possible. Yeah, no, I think nobody should say emphatically one way or the other that Donald Trump's not going to get elected again. I think that's very possible. Do I think it's likely? I mean, he's an old fucking guy. I mean, Biden's an old fucking guy. I think the prospect of I think everybody, Republican and Democrat in the United States, should be able to unify around the idea that running, in 2020, we had the spectacle of two different versions of doddering dementia running against each other to be the most powerful man on the planet. That was 2020. It would be an extraordinary shame if we, in 2024, saw the same decrepit crones running against each other again. Is that possible? Yes. Should we work pretty hard to talk about how stupid it would be if we had to watch Trump and Biden run against each other again? Yes, we should also talk about that. Obviously, I would prefer Biden to win the 2024 election to Trump, but Jesus, I'd really like anybody else. Thoughts on Musk buying Twitter? Oh, I don't wanna. I think it's a terrible distraction. I'm somebody who is a fan of Elon Musk. I'm someone who's deeply, deeply impressed by Elon Musk. I think that both SpaceX and Tesla are doing tremendously valuable work. I think the sort of standard, like, oh, we hate Musk now approach to Tesla being like, oh, well, he didn't really do anything there. And like, he bought the company. He didn't really do anything. Like, it's just deep-dyed ignorance of how far away we were from electric cars 15 years ago. And Elon Musk personally made that happen. Would we have gotten to this level of electric car adoption eventually anyway? Yeah, probably, but it would have been a decade later or 2 decades later. Elon Musk and Tesla, tremendously important. SpaceX, arguably even more important. The problem with space exploration is, yes, that it's one of the most difficult things that human beings can do. It's hostile. I have my suspicions about the viability of this genetic version of humanity being able to actually live on Mars. But what Musk has done to disrupt government contracting in the United States is extraordinary. I don't think anybody's really quite realized it, but SpaceX's achievements are mind-blowingly stunning. He's a tremendously important, valuable figure. And to see him pivot to piss away his incredibly valuable time and effort on a fucking social media company it seems really sad to me. Twitter is something that functioned. It is something that I spend way too much of my life on. It's vital for my work. I also enjoy it. I think that there's real positives to it. It didn't need to be saved. Like it was gonna just continue to function and function fine. And Elon Musk wasting his time on that because I think like it's got to be really weird to be Elon Musk. People talk a lot about how he speaks about living in a simulation, and yeah, like I would feel if my life had gone as well as Elon Musk's has gone, of just being constantly rewarded for everything I did, and mm, laying out obscenely ambitious goals and meeting them constantly, yeah, I would think I lived in a simulation as well. So I guess at this point, he just was like, SpaceX and Tesla are, though I would not argue they are safe or settled accomplishments in any ways. I guess he just wanted a challenge or something. He wanted to just disprove that we're in a simulation. Like the amount of risk that he has taken on that will jeopardize his much more important efforts in SpaceX and Tesla. It's just, I just think it's a terrible idea. And you know what? Maybe he's such an all-fired genius that he's gonna go do a great job in this thing that, unfortunately, a distressing amount of the smartest people in the world have been focused on for the past 20 years. That's the thing. What's so great about Elon Musk is that he's kind of a weirdly 19th or 20th century industrialist, almost the only one we have, and he made it work. He didn't decide to, figure out how to better market advertising or get you a package quicker through a drone or what have you. He built real things, a car company and a rocket ship company. I think what's so great about what he did is he proves that it's possible, and I think it's arguable that some of his success in those endeavors comes from the fact that nobody else was trying because everybody else was so intimidated by the very real barriers to entry. And his success there is a potentially really positive harbinger of other people making efforts in those arenas. There was no shortage of smart people, brilliant people, and Elon Musk is a brilliant person, no shortage of the smartest people on the planet who've been going into social media marketing for the past 20 years. Who've been, there was some tweet that put it really well, like all the smartest people, breaking people, it's just a big fucking billboard. What the tragedy of Elon Musk going into Twitter is that he's gone from being the only brilliant person in the real world doing real things with real money to joining all the other members of Mensa in the fucking digital billboard business. So I don't know if he's going to be successful in the digital billboard business. I hope he is, because if he's not successful with Twitter, he's set up the debt structure and whatnot. I mean, I don't know. He's got great lawyers working for him. Maybe it's not as straightforwardly potentially potentially catastrophic as your average Bloomberg columnist will tell you. But I think the general consensus is that if he doesn't figure out how to make a lot more money with Twitter than it has ever made, then he could be at risk of personal bankruptcy. He could lose control of SpaceX or Tesla. He could break this extraordinary engine for human positivity that has been his career thus far. So yeah, sorry, I obviously have feelings about Elon Musk and Twitter, and I think it's a sad, bad idea. Not because I hate Elon, but because I freaking think Elon's awesome. Yeah, I mean, Elon is the reason that this YouTube channel still exists, by the way. He didn't make me independently wealthy, but this is not a successful YouTube channel. But the reason it's existed, especially over the past 2-3 years of largely getting crushed, is because I bought some Tesla stock 10 years ago. And we're coming to the end of that runway, but yeah, I am a big Elon fan, and I think the Twitter thing is a misstep, but I could be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. Okay, this election solidifies Brazil's democracy a bit better, understood, but missed why Brazil loves Russia portion. I think the reason that Brazil loves Russia, that overstates it a little bit for SEO purposes, but the reason why Brazil is much more open to critiquing U.S. efforts in Ukraine and Russia is because Brazil is free to do so. because Brazil is one of just a handful of countries like China and Iran, sorry, not Iran, and India, that is big enough and powerful enough that it can, is big enough and powerful enough that it can um, uh, act in dissent against the U.S. empire, can speak out against the U.S. empire without fear of their country being destroyed the way that Yemen was destroyed by a vote against the United States that it took at the UN in 1990. I think that Brazil is tremendously suspicious of U.S. actions with relation to U.S. and Ukraine because it can see it as something that it is, which is a very successful imperial U.S. program of divide and conquer that has worked entirely. And I say that as somebody who supports Ukrainian independence, someone who likes Zelensky, someone who's now got on board and is eager to see Russia humiliated for its imperial actions. But it is quite clearly, it's a 20-year plan of divide and conquer that the United States pulled off spectacularly. And Brazil, India, China, these are places that are have been victims of imperialism. And unlike most countries in the world that have been victims of imperialism, they are systemically, economically important enough that they know that the United States can't just get pissed at a vote that they took in the UN General Assembly and destroy their country the way the United States destroyed Yemen in 1990. So that is Reynold Cherry, the answer to your question. I hope that is sufficient. Okay, I got that super chat. I got that super chat. Moribus and Artipus. Thoughts on Brazil's export capabilities? That gives me an excuse to bring up this visual aid that I did not bring up. So this is Brazil GDP per capita. I think I had talked about, so you can see from roughly 2000 to 2010 or so that, well, actually, no, beyond 2010, well into, that's probably 2013, the taper tantrum, where it peaks. This is Brazilian GDP per capita. And you can see that the period of Lula and Dilma being in office was just an extraordinarily successful one. And then in 2013, it fell apart. Things fell off a cliff with the taper tantrum, with just general fall in oil and gas prices, with Petrobras. Brazil is a commodity exporter. So what this graph here is yes, I think it does indicate to some extent why Lula is so popular. He was a successful administrator of this bounty, but that's also China. Lula is successful, was able to give Brazil such a golden age because Brazil is a commodity exporter. Not just, I think oil and gas is more of a recent development, but they, tremendous exports of soybeans, tremendous exports of a wide range of agricultural products, sugar, I think, traditionally, and now many other. I think The Economist did a profile on one particular Brazilian, one particular Brazilian district. I think it's called Minas Gerais, which is like General Mines. There is a large Brazilian state called Mines. Brazil is a commodity exporter. And if you have a really amazing experience, as the world had in the first decade of the 21st century, where you just see this hockey stick line here between 2000 and 2010, that's China. And it is China and its demand for the world's commodities, and Brazil's commodities in particular, is the reason why Lula was so incredibly successful. Now, there are differing interpretations. One reason why Bolsonaro was able to come back is this uptick here in 2021, which I believe was continued to some degree in 2022, after largely being seen as quite unsuccessful in dealing with the COVID issues. The Brazilian economy bounced back. because of this year's commodity focus that we've been seeing so much of. It's good for Brazil when commodities are in demand. And a lot of how Lula is going to do in his second period in power depends on how the world's commodity resources go. I firmly believe that by the end of the decade, the oil and gas that Brazil extracts is going to be a lot less valuable, especially because if I recall correctly, a lot of Brazilian oil and gas is tremendously complex and expensive to extract. I believe it's under salt flats in the water off of Brazil, a lot of it. That's going to be the kind of thing that we extract less of. But are there other commodities that Brazil is going to be well suited towards extracting? I don't know if Brazil is big in copper or lithium, two substances that are expected to be a huge issue for are expected to be huge items in demand for electric cars, lithium and copper. I don't know what Brazil's profile is there, but there are rare earths. There's many, many different things that Brazil might be capable of providing that would help. A lot depends on what's going to happen with the world economy. Does inflation get beaten in the next 3 or 4 months or so, at which point the US Federal Reserve lays off and we go back to trying to expand the world economy? Or have we got long-term inflation in the United States and a Fed that just keeps on hiking and keeps on attempting to crush the US and world economies? Don't know. Hard to say. So a lot of how Lula is going to do in this period in office depends on things that are not really up to Lula. Let's see. Christopher Murtaugh, what are your thoughts on social media, especially Twitter, and its danger to democracy? I'm not bullish on Elon being wise enough to save Twitter and not further promote the disaster that is the new GOP. I like social media. I'm a big fan of it. I think my life, my business isn't possible without it. I think that there are a lot of bad things that have happened because of social media to some extent. Though, I mean, honestly, like, is Donald Trump really something that happened because of Facebook, or is it something happened because of television? I feel like Fox News is a lot more important. Social media, like television, is a tool, and it depends on what you funnel into that tool. I think that with every medium, I think there's famous discussion of Socrates, right? Obviously, this is apocryphal because Socrates did not write things down, but I believe there's something in Plato or elsewhere talking about how Socrates, a famous Greek philosopher of the 400s before the Common Era, so this is 2,500 years ago, more or less, 2,400 years ago, Socrates was talking about what a damn shame it was that people were writing now, because writing just made people so much dumber and really reduced the quality of thought and public participation. So I think that for sure we are right now dealing with some of the downsides of social media. The printed word, books, something that seemed like an unreserved positive right now, but 500 years ago, the printed word, books, one of their most direct results was 2 centuries of incredibly vicious religious conflict in Europe. The 30 Years' War of the 1640s would not have been possible without Gutenberg putting together. Okay, that overstates things. The 30 Years' War of the 1640s is famously one of the worst religious conflicts in human history. It killed 30% of Germany. It was also very much more about politics than it was about religion. But the content of the political wrangling that killed off untold millions in Europe over the course of centuries was provided by the printed word. It was provided by the fact that you could get religious tracts out much more clearly, much more quickly. But the Reformation also had positive reactions. So I'm not like, um, do I think we need more control of social media? I mean, maybe. I don't know. But I'm not as big on the idea that social media is some kind of evil or some kind of corruption of a world that was just going along perfectly fine and being hunky dory. So certainly, I think it's fair to some extent to say that Trump is a product of social media and that's bad. But do you know what else I see as a very clear product of social media is gay marriage in the United States. I think that both gay marriage and marijuana legalization, another really good example of causes that from throughout my childhood and into my 20s were seen as just like, oh well, those are never going to change. That's just something that never changes. That's just how things are. um, that's just the way the world works. Sorry. And that's over now. Marijuana is legal. People are talking about cocaine now, which is a good thing. Gay rights made extraordinary progress since the beginning of my adult life, and I think that's down to social media too. So, will social media eventually give us a 30 years war type thing? Honestly, probably, yeah. Should we take efforts towards regulating social media in new and different ways? I think there's probably a decent argument for that, but I haven't put any thought into it. So I can't. My default generally is for freedom and hands offness until somebody has provided a better plan for me. And I have not seen a better plan on social media. It's now, I think we've had recent revelations. I've only read the tweets, I haven't read the article, which is a disturbing habit I've been falling into. But my understanding is that there have been some new revelations. Facebook and Twitter have both just been sitting down with the Department of Homeland Security over a period of years now to say what do you think as the U.S. government? What do you think is disinformation, and can we take that down for you? That's something that just happens, and I don't think that's a good thing. But yeah. What about Brazilian coffee? It's fuel for humans. It's a good point. Good point. Humans need to be fueled. Jack Hawkins, Iran supplying Russia with attack drones. Is this the future of BRICS, functioning as a military alliance against the West? Jack, I've been thinking about that a lot. There was a great tweet thread I read the past week or so talking about what Russia is doing in Ukraine with those drones. I think there's a lot of snarkiness about those drones. They're $20,000 drones. They don't have many capabilities. You can knock them down fairly easily. You can knock them down with a machine gun. But reading that tweet thread was like, well, yeah, actually, that's the point. One of the things that Ukraine is desperately asking for is more air defenses. And the way that the United States, at least, has been organizing air defense in the period over the past 80 years when we haven't actually, well, no, Vietnam was a real war with real air defense issues. But since Vietnam, we haven't had to fight a real war, frankly. We just haven't. Or the real opponents we've faced have been so quickly obliterated. But like Saddam Hussein's Iraq or whatever resistance Noriega was able to put up. That actually these Russian usage of these $20,000 Iranian drones are being sent at Kyiv, being sent at all these places with really, really strong air defense capacities. But the air defense is this $20,000 drone getting taken out by a $1 million missile. The math on that ends up not working out very well for not just the Ukrainian defenders, but also for the United States more generally, if it ever gets into a real war. So I think there's a lot of snarkiness about these Iranian drones and how, oh, they just don't have these capabilities, this, that, and the other thing. That is probably actually making it pretty clear. I was sort of wondering why the Iranians would be doing this, sort of giving away the details of these capabilities, antagonizing the United States during a point where it supposedly was still interested in getting back into the JCPOA. Like, why would it be doing that sort of thing? But also, I think what it's demonstrating is just how incredibly dangerous it would be for the United States to fall into a larger war against Iran. Because if Iran can just, I think it's sold thousands of these crappy little drones to Russia, presumably because it's got tens to hundreds of thousands more of them. Well, if it sends a shitty Shahed drone into to kill some U.S. soldiers in Qatar, where we have like 10,000 U.S. soldiers and bases, if it sends two drones, well, they'll get knocked out by $1 million missiles. And if it sends 50 drones, they'll get knocked out by $50 million missiles. But what if it sends 5,000 drones against that base in Qatar? Well, then Iran kills 10,000 U.S. soldiers. So it's interesting. I think this is a real shift that I've been talking about before, specifically in why Washington D.C. is Taiwan's biggest enemy. It's like the United States is way, 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 way too focused on absolutely useless pieces of equipment like aircraft carriers and fighter jets. This is where we spend the majority of our money in defense spending because the point of our defense spending is spending money for congressional corruption purposes. That's just true. So I do worry where like this kind of quick and dirty Shahed type stuff. Yeah, like we have U.S. soldiers still, because we're fucking idiots, in the Middle East where they could be taken out by these really shitty little drones just because they are orders of magnitude, not a order of magnitude, orders of magnitude cheaper to put in the field than the U.S. overpriced stuff. The U.S. stuff, some U.S. stuff has been proven to be valuable on the Ukrainian field. Like HIMARS does stuff that Russians can't really counter, or had to work really hard to figure out how to counter. Our stuff works better than Russian stuff. The Russians have some things that are pretty high end, but they've got one or two of them, whereas the U.S. is wealthy enough to produce hundreds of these sorts of things. But the hundreds of fighter jets, the even dozen aircraft carriers, are probably going to be worthless against 2,000 of these crappy little drones that cost a tenth of an aircraft carrier. So yeah, like it would cost Iran a tenth as much as what an aircraft carrier costs to sink it. I don't know. I'm not speaking with any confidence about this math, but I don't think the math is very far off from that. So yeah, I think I had initially been like, I don't get it. Why is Iran doing this? What pointless antagonizing? But no, I think the Iranians have probably demonstrated some real capabilities here that should get the Israelis and well, the Israelis don't care, because if the Israelis start a war with Iran, they know that the U.S. has to finish it for them. But I think the Americans are looking at the capabilities, or not the capabilities of the drones themselves, but what the sheer mass of the drones are doing to Ukraine's stockpiles of over-expensive U.S. and European created air defense stuff, and it's giving them pause. Yeah, but I mean, functioning as a military alliance against the West, I think that's oversold. But but the most fucking frustrating thing is it's illustrating something that I've said over and over and over again, which is war is bad. Specifically, war is bad for the hegemon. War is bad for the the U.S. empire could go on forever if we didn't fucking start wars all the time. And yeah, the United States definitely, like the war in Ukraine would not be happening without the United States at like a million different levels. And you got to be honest about that. It's not, now I'm not to say that the US, I'd say before 2022, 100% the US was much more culpable in bringing about Ukraine crises, the Ukraine war. But after 2022, Putin's insane and evil decision to invade Ukraine with regular forces, Russia's definitely more morally to blame. Putin's the bad guy here. 100% agree with that. But you can't let that distract you from the other 30 years of history, and that the United States worked really fucking hard to bring about exactly this conflict. Like, we're psyched about it. And I think that those Iranian drones, Jack, are pretty important because that's the first indication that I've seen where it's like, that's the kind of thing. Like, that's like the Iranian drones are like kind of like that moment in like, June of 2003 or something like that, where it began to dawn on the American public that, oh wait, maybe like this, because in March of March through April of 2003, like it was, or maybe it was the end of 2003, or actually maybe it wasn't until 2005 because Bush won re-election. But like, when that moment where the U.S. public is like, oh wait, like even if, because it's hard to remember, but so the spring of 2003, the U.S. invasion of Iraq looked like a stunning, stunning success. The beauty of our weapons just crushing this upstart. And then like I do see like those Iranian drones, like, because that's something that can happen with a long war here, is that people figure out ways to defeat our amazing, amazing systems, as the Iraqi insurgency did with IEDs, very cheap and easy. And Iran might be with these, cheap mass-produced missiles, drone loitering munitions, or whatever the fuck you call them. So yeah. Let's see. Questions. But Zihan and Friedman said that Turkey would be a global superpower by 2020. I mean, in Zihan and Friedman's defense, in 5 minutes, like I would say that Turkey is certainly nowhere near what Friedman was talking about like a decade ago. I think I read a Friedman book talking about the Turkish superpower like a decade ago, but closer to it than I would have expected. Like I read that a decade ago and laughed my ass off. But like Turkey, like it is new and different and strange to see countries other than the United States doing large scale power projection. Like even in most of the Cold War, the Soviet Union's big nasty invasion of another country, Hungary in 1956 in the early Cold War, when I think there was a real Cold War, but like Korea and Hungary in the 50s, which were places that were on the border of the communist world, and like Afghanistan in the 1980s, which played a huge part in destroying the Soviet Union. That was like right over the border from what was Russian territory at that point. So it's very strange to see a country projecting power beyond its own borders, and that is what Turkey's doing in Libya. Admittedly, they did that because the United States was fucking dumb enough to destroy Libya and leave it as a anarchic mess for a decade. But like Turkey's a more serious power than your crying, laughing emojis might indicate. An S-300 missile costs $1 million, says Levi's Cool Extreme. Yeah, I mean, yes, and I think it's interesting because Russia has kind of beclowned itself by attempting to play. I think that's the lesson that China and Russia and any potential adversary of the United States should be learning from this, was just how stupid it is to try to play on the U.S.'s chosen territory of like, now we're going to have an 8th generation fighter jet, or like China dumping all these incredible resources into having an aircraft carrier when the only potential war that they're going to fight is right off their coastline. Like it's dumb. The real war is volume, and volume of missiles and drones. So yeah, the S-300 is supposedly so impressive, but yeah, it's a missile. It's this really impressive air defense thing that, yeah, that $1 million missile is totally worthwhile to shoot down an F-35. But if you're spending that $1 million missile to shoot down a fucking $10,000 loitering munition, you've just cost your country $990,000 for nothing. Angel Balanzar, More Freedom Foundation, the Iranians only gave Russia the less impressive drones and missiles. The Iranians have much better and still cheap drones and missiles. Yeah, I think it's a real sort of revolution in military military affairs. Revolution in military affairs is a very loaded term that Donald Rumsfeld loved, but it is a real paradigm shift in military stuff that I've been talking about. Tons of other people have been talking about for years. Just how missiles are what's important, there's real implications for Taiwan as well. It's like, yes, missiles are what's important. I think there's been some signs in recent years that people are waking up to that. That if Taiwan needs to be mass producing cheap missiles if it's going to save itself. But are the missiles that we're finally providing to Taiwan, are they going to be the $20,000 kind of missiles, or are they the $1 million kind of missiles? The answer should be both. We need to be doing both. So who is more pro-Ukraine and more pro-Russia? Bolsonaro is definitely more definitely more pro-Russia. But neither of them are particularly pro-Ukraine. Lula gave an interview. I mean, Lula, we don't know what Lula is going to be. Lula gave he hasn't been in power. Lula gave an interview. I can't remember if it was May or October. I should have linked it in the description. I did not. But Lula gave an interview where he talked quite openly about just mocking Zelensky. This is after the Russian invasion in February. Just mocking Zelensky. Is this, who is this fucking actor? He didn't use profanity, but who's this actor? He's been just as aggressive as Putin, et cetera, et cetera. And this is after Russia invaded. But yeah, so Bolsonaro, because he's been in charge of Brazil and directing those votes against U.S. interests at the United Nations. And I think Bolsonaro, I think Bolsonaro had like a state visit to Russia in February, but I've seen some stuff indicating that not even China was really in the loop on what Russia was planning in February of 2022. It's damn sure that Bolsonaro was not in the loop on what Putin was planning. So I think but I do think it's fair to say that Bolsonaro is more pro-Russia. That's just sort of the way that Bolsonaro has oriented himself throughout his time in power. I'm a strong man. I'm, maybe anti-liberal, that sort of thing. How many Latin American leaders support Ukraine, and how many support Russia? Who cares? And I think that was something I wanted to say. It's just like, it is so much better, and it has so much better long-term potential. And this is going to seem very self-interested as someone from the United States who just says, don't defy me. It's better for you if you don't defy me. It is so much better if a country does what China did in the 90s and the aughts, and not in the teens, and what Brazil appears to be doing now, which is just focus more on building up your own institutional weight, power, and wealth, and democratic success. It's so much more, because that's how we get to a better world, with countries that can say, like, we're running ourselves fine. Like what Russia did and what China unfortunately is allowing happen is doing is providing excuses for the U.S. the militarist side of U.S. empire. Like, a lot of people can angrily tweet that Bolsonaro and Lula, are insufficiently respectful of our divide and conquer plan in Ukraine, but like, they're not going to do anything about it because, like, Brazil isn't actually like doing anything in support of Russia. I mean, I think they are buying a lot of Russian goods, but like, that's they need Russian goods. They need things. I think generally, I think there's a lot of polling, a lot of indications that most Latin American countries probably lean a little more towards Russia, but aren't going to do anything about it. I don't think anybody thinks that Russia should have invaded in February. I mean, very few people think Russia should have invaded in February. But I think that the global South more generally can see that there's a lot more to the story than like the coup of dignity or whatever, or just the fact that Russia invaded. Like, yes, Russia invaded, it was evil and wrong, and we should all root for that imperial project to be disappointed. But I think that folks in the global South can see a little more clearly that it's also the fruition of a decades long US imperial project. Russia getting its ass handed to them. So, yeah, but I like, as far as how many Latin American leaders, I think they're all, I think Brazil's probably the only one where its leaders would be as vocal and open as Lula was, because all of the other countries that are not Brazil, that don't have 215 million people, that don't have such serious economic weight and resources that the world needs, know that if they were to come out and be like, fuck Zelensky, let's talk about peace, they know that they could be punished by the United States for that. So it's very hard to say. I mean, I'm sure Bolivia is pretty openly pro-Russia. Obviously, Maduro. Actually, Maduro has kind of been falling off a little bit because he sees an opportunity to get back in the U.S.'s good graces, and we should all hope that he takes it. Yeah, Bolsonaro is more pro-USA when Trump is in power. Sure, of course. I was in Brazil earlier this year. They just got KFC. They're not super anti-American. No, I'm not saying they're anti-American. I think they just can be a little more honest about what's happening in Ukraine than we are in the United States. I agree that social media can be good. Christopher Murtaugh. Thank you so much. Very generous today, Christopher Murtaugh, and also a Patreon. Thank you. Very, very kind. I agree that social media can be good, but it's so vastly different in the context of our democracy or design. I think that's very true. We haven't learned how to compensate for its faults and learn to adapt yet. Yeah, like it's. I read, and this is actually part of like why I find Brazil's politics so attractive in interesting ways, and why I think the U.S. has a lot to learn from them, is that reading about 19th century politics in the United States versus 20th century politics in the United States, like our politics might not even be good enough, might be, I agree entirely, Christopher, that like our politics aren't well situated for dealing with the era of social media. I don't think they're well situated for dealing with the era of television. Like in the 19th century, like people really, really cared about politics in the United States. It was sports, it was, and yeah, it was back then, like our politics were a lot more lethal. Like we had riots and fights, and it was much more corrupt and nasty. And I wouldn't want to go back to the violence and the corruption of 19th century American politics, but I do think some of that investment of just people generally, like, would be good. And I think social media provides opportunities for that. But I agree that like our whole structure of democracy has not figured out how to optimize that. And yeah, that's maybe even more that we have to learn from Brazil. How are they handling social media in ways that the U.S. is not? Why is China? This is a great question. Angel Balance. Why is China getting so much hate from this war? Did China even want Russia to bog itself down in Ukraine? That's a really interesting question. It's not. So China isn't just getting hate from this war. China is getting really massive, massive actions against it by the United States, because the United States now believes that it has a more serious chance it believes, and is accurately believes, that it has a stronger coalition behind it. From 2003 on, Europe and the United States had a much more fraught relationship because of the US invasion of Iraq against the wishes of the more powerful countries in Europe. Europe had pretensions. I made a whole video about this. Europe had more pretensions of independence. Russia's incredibly foolish invasion of Ukraine has ended that. Europe is now on the US's side more firmly than it has been at any point since 2003, debatably even since the 1950s. China has been very careful not to back Russia to the hilt, not to back Russia to the degree that it promised to in February. I think Russia's very disappointed at the lack of Chinese support that they've gotten. Regardless, the United States has, for a decade now, wanted to turn more heavily against China and has been held back by the fact that most of the U.S. allies were less into it. Europe is now open to that because Europe is being completely bankrolled and defended by the United States at this point. And Europe is, of course, to add to that, is becoming now dependent on U.S. natural resources the way it used to be dependent on Russian natural resources. So Russia, over the past 2 decades, even after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, was still playing a game because obviously, I think rationally, was trying to balance Russia against the United States because Russia's so infinitely weaker than the United States, and Europe just wanted to preserve some independence and was using Russia to do that. Now they can't. Europe has given up. Europe is now just a full-on U.S. vassal, 1950s style again, and that means there's been some pushback on this in Germany in particular, but it also means that Europe's a lot more open to backing U.S. plays against China. So that's why the United States has been able to act much more viciously against China post-Ukraine, even though China isn't backing up Russia to the extent that Russia expected it to. Let's see. So Angel Ballin says, so now that Iranian drones are undermining Ukraine's war effort, would it be better to sue for peace as this war seems like the borders aren't going to change? Yeah, I am a very pro-peace guy. I would love it if we could stop this war. I think stopping all wars is a really good idea. It's also not just a good idea, it's always in U.S. interest to stop wars. I think the value of these Iranian drones being proven should be an indication in the United States that we should be smarter about what's the word I'm looking for? We should be less drone friendly, but yeah, that's not necessarily going to be the case. Yeah, I just don't know. Yeah, war bad. I'm pretty confident about war bad. Check out Brazil. Let's see, and the momentum is not so much Russian but Chinese. What do you think? There's a momentum in Latin America with the election of Lula, Petro, Boric, etc. And the momentum is not so much Russian, but Chinese. What do you think? I think that's fucking nonsense. Sorry, Samuel Graff. I don't think there's Chinese momentum. No, I think there's, like, Latin Americans are pissed. I think that Obama was incredibly intelligent in not really caring much about Venezuela, opening to Cuba, and I think you saw, in part because of Obama's very sensible diplomacy towards Latin America, his finally allowing the Cold War to fade away. You saw the first pink wave dissipate entirely. It just went away because a lot of the leftist instinct in Latin America is generated by fear of U.S. imperialism. And when the U.S. is acting viciously imperialist, as it certainly was during the Bush administration, it was during the Obama administration as well, too, but that was focused still on the Middle East rather than on Latin America. the left wave dissipated. And then you had Trump come into office, shut down all the opening to Cuba, threaten invasion of Venezuela repeatedly. I think he threatened Nicaragua as well. Destroy Venezuela. To be clear, the Venezuelan government destroyed its own economy first, but then, in a context of already humanitarian catastrophe, the United States swooped in and shut down what was left of the Venezuelan economy. And in that context, you now have the picture was going around Twitter recently. You now have a new, almost complete left-wing wave. I think it's like Uruguay, Paraguay, and Ecuador are the only countries that don't have a left-leaning government. So it's not like Chinese or Russian influence. It's exclusively. I'm sure the Russians and the Chinese flatter themselves to pretending that it's Chinese or Russian influence. It's because most of what China and Russia believe about themselves is just rehashed. The governments rehashed Pentagon propaganda. No, it's not China or Russia. It is a straightforward, legitimate, democratic, freedom-centered reaction to U.S. dumb shit. And like, you know what? If Biden's not going to be there for another 2 years. I mean, if DeSantis gets in 2024, like fuck, I don't know. I mean, you're going to have Latin American countries going communist again. But if somehow a Democrat wins in 2024, then I think you'll see this left wing wave crash and burn just as much as any other ones. Like it's good for different. This may seem controversial on both sides. It's actually good for countries when people with different ideas come to power and then succeed or fail and lose power. Like that's a good thing. And I think we're seeing that in Latin America. I think that trying to pathologize it and make it about China and Russia is just kind of silly. And what is interesting about this new left wing wave is that they're a lot more, they're not, by and large, they're not like Chavistas. They're not like these dumbasses who try to pick fights with. I think there's a really positive movement in Latin America where they're just like, let's try to do things in our own country and just sort of smile and nod at the United States and, just focus on our own stuff and try to fix deep-seated problems here. And I think that'll make for a stronger, better Latin America. So yeah, like I think pathologizing it, making it about China and Russia is just Pentagon propaganda. I think China could offer more to Latin America about rising living standards there. I don't think China's kind of like, if you look at what's happening to Belt and Road, China is shutting down the amount of money that it spends abroad. Like it'll keep committing money to Pakistan because Pakistan is, its strategic backdoor gives China access to resources if it were to find itself in a war in the South China Sea. But the rest of the Belt and Road is China's largely falling off. They're going to probably end up becoming a much more normal funder or loaner of money to developing countries. They tried with Venezuela, actually. One of the sadder aspects of Venezuela is that Venezuela very loudly pitched itself as like, fuck the U.S. We're gonna stand up against these bastards, and that's what we're about. And Russia and China loaned them a lot of money on the strength of that. And then eventually both Russia and China were like, we're going to stop loaning you money because you're not paying us back. So, yeah, I don't think China has that, especially now that most people are conceding that China's economy will not be surpassing the U.S. economy anytime soon. I think the idea that China is just going to go out and like raise the living standards of Latin America is kind of farcical. Do you have anything to say about the elections in Israel? No, I do not. I do not like Netanyahu. I think Netanyahu is a servant of U.S. defense companies. I've gotten to know Netanyahu over the course of decades at this point. Yeah, Netanyahu was the Israeli prime minister as a very young guy. He was very young to be Israeli prime minister, but he was the Israeli prime minister when I was in high school in the 1990s. Like that dude has been around for a long time, and I am very ready for him to not be around. I guess that's what I have to say about Israeli elections. But I haven't been following it really. Also, will Lula continue cooperation with BRICS? Absolutely, I would expect so. Yeah, I mean, like Lula, like is non-aligned. Like, there's so much potential for like a broad-based, like non-aligned movement right now. Because unlike the '60s, so the non-aligned movement was it Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia, um, Nehru in India, Nasser in Egypt. Indonesia was part of the non-aligned movement as well, I believe, even though they were slaughtering communists wholesale. Um, in the mid 20th century, there was a movement of countries who were like, we don't want your Cold War. Like, just, we are not aligned. We are not part of the US or Soviet camps, whatever. And they were politically significant, they were important, but by and large, they were incredibly poor. Um, Today, a non-aligned movement that actually is seriously non-aligned, that it's just like, just fucking leave us behind with your secondary sanctions and your bullshit. We just want to trade with anybody. We don't care. Leave us alone. If a unified sort of non-aligned movement that was just sort of like, China, U.S., whatever, I don't care. Leave us alone, has so much more weight and power. I think that would be good. That'd be very good. And Lula has always been interested. I think there was a Lula, was it Lula and Erdogan? I think that had when the JCPOA was being formulated, like they were like, we'll do our own deal with Iran, and like went and chatted and talked to Ahmadinejad, and like Obama was like, what the fuck are you trying to do? It's a very interesting little section of history there. But yeah, I think it was somebody else. It was, but yeah, like there's a real potential for a serious non-aligned movement that could, I think, to some extent, restrain and contain China and the United States. But I think the path to that, and I think Lula understands this, is to get your own house in order and to be able to get your own house in order to the extent that you can use that wealth that is now present. So yeah. Do, 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 do. Do Israeli nationalists not realize that Arabs were inhabiting and having kingdoms in Israel 1,000 years before the Muslim empires? Were they? 1,000 years before the Muslim empires. I mean, that doesn't match with my sense of history. I mean, those were Greeks and Jews. Yeah. I mean, 1,000 years from the Muslim empires, we're getting into biblical times, practically. Not quite, but pretty close. No, 1,000 years before the Muslim empires. That is biblical times. Like, I don't. Arabs were inhabiting Israel. That's news to me. Let's see. One thing, but also, like, even if it were true, like, what do I care about 2,500 years ago? I really don't care about 2,500 years ago. That's something I'm pretty clear on. Like, I'm somewhat very conversant with ancient history. I gave a TEDx talk on ancient history once. But like, I've as the years have gone on, I've become more and more rooted in the sense that very little. It's fun to read about and interesting, but very little that happened before industrialization actually matters for contemporary politics. Low question. What are the chances the GOP becomes more violent after the attack on Pelosi's husband? Also, as a Gen X, what do you know about Gamergate? I know nothing about Gamergate. I remember Gamergate being a big thing. I know that Gamergate was like, I think it was like, was it Anita Sarkeesian? Does that stick in my head? It was like sort of a backlash against wokeness in the video game industry. and certain commentators and companies, and that I think that it threw up a lot of early figures like was it Milo Yiannopoulos and like folks who became loud alt-right Trump supporters. But that's all I know about Gamergate. I was not invested or um, I really didn't get on Twitter until the 2016 election. That was when I started really. That's when Twitter got me, and has slowly colonized more and more of my brain ever since. So I was aware of Gamergate, but I wasn't really following it. Fadel, Egypt is going to have a 40 billion deficit this year. Jesus, and the Gulf monarchies are not coughing the needed funds up. The IMF is not. Oh, that's I hadn't really thought about it, Fadel, but like it's just it's entirely plausible and a really horrific possibility that like the sort of prelude to Saudi Arabia's fall will be Egypt just like collapsing. God, that's grim. Eric Cole says, "Where do you read news, history, etc.? I struggle to find good sources these days. Books, mostly books. That's if I'm not reading a book a week, I feel that I've failed. I also like boring reports. Like I spent actually not enough time on this Brazil thing, but boring reports like World Bank reports, less boring reports like Chatham House or International Crisis Group. I'll often, what one thing I find really interesting is if you want to read about, if you want to learn about a subject, like read like the last 6 months of stories about a subject from the New York Times or something like that. Like if you want to figure out what the biases of what you're reading are, like read about the shit that they got wrong over the past 6 months. The stuff that they keep talking about. Like everything is biased, everything is problematic. But if you read enough, you start getting a sense of like what the biases of what you read are. Like as a kid, like I would like in college, like I would get high and read The Economist cover to cover. Like I loved that magazine. I thought it was amazing, and it told me what the world was, and I loved it. I still read a lot of The Economist. I still subscribe to it. I now know that half the time they're full of shit, but that actually makes it a more valuable source of information for me because I know what its biases are. I know many of the places where I should be suspicious of it. Have you heard of Dr. Roy Cassandra? I've not. Were there any countries before Egypt with famous architecture? Of course, Göbekli Tepe. There's many, 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 many. I mean, Egypt is very lucky in that it was building in an environment that sort of naturally preserves building. I think Egypt was legitimately more impressive and long lasting than most other civilizations, but there were certainly cultures contemporaneous with Egypt, before Egypt, that left behind extraordinary architecture. All right, well, so we seem to be closing down. We've got 4 minutes left. For those who, there you go. Okay. Eric Gold says, "Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I actually haven't smoked marijuana in almost 2 decades now, but that was something I would do in college." Thank you for that super chat, Eric. Thanks. I smoke sometimes from time to time. Nothing like reading history when being stoned. I agree. It's fun. All right. So I think it's time to, unless you've got more super chats, I think it's time for me to go. I'll start pitching. My name is Robert Morris. I do something more than a short on YouTube every Tuesday. That's what this is. I'm trying to. I recently had all my wisdom teeth out last week, so I sort of fell off on the daily shorts, but I can be found on YouTube at Mo Freedom Foundation, on TikTok and Instagram at More Freedom Foundation. I'd love some more. If you're on Instagram, and you're not following me on Instagram yet at More Freedom Foundation. I finally got it together to do a dedicated More Freedom Foundation Instagram, and it desperately needs more followers. But what was I going to say? So Instagram, um, the More Freedom Foundation is entirely supported by folks who view it. YouTube advertising, the books that I sell, but most importantly, my Patreon account. I've just noticed I'm down to 100 patrons, which is tremendously grateful for each and every one of them. But I could certainly use some more. Especially as the stock market has been collapsing. I'm getting to a point where I need a little more money. If folks could contribute through PayPal or on Patreon, that'd be much appreciated. Patreon, folks, so I usually do once a month. I do a large public chat like this. I also do one for the patrons only. It's the patrons only newscast. I try to develop every single question that the patrons ask me about. So I do like 20 minutes of research on every single question that patrons have for me. Won't be able to do that forever, but that's what I can do now. That's every month. It's a chat like this, except I interact with every single comment and do some prep beforehand. It's the patrons only newscast, happens once a month. We also have a Discord server that's just for the patrons. I really come to love it. I didn't know what a Discord server was, but Loga introduced me to it. And it's just a bunch of folks who really care about geopolitics, about their regions, about other regions, talking about it. It's a pretty high-minded level of discussion. It's pretty great. I would highly recommend signing up on Patreon, getting access to the Discord server. Also on the Discord server, we do like a Zoom chat once a month, which is just like I don't prepare anything. We just hang out, about 2 hours long. I get to hear the voices, see the faces of the folks that support this channel. I really enjoy that. I've written a couple books that I would highly recommend you look into. Let me see. I'm gonna go grab those. Yeah, grab them right now. Books, visual aids. We've got everybody's. We have Everybody's Lying About Islam, which talks about the details of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, which are basically what everything that terrorism was about. Remember terrorism? It was like a big deal for a while. It was sort of the bridging fuel that got the military-industrial complex from the Cold War to the current era of antagonizing Russia and China. And basically, it was all about Saudi Arabia. And I wrote that about this. I wrote Avoiding the British Empire, which is like a incredibly thick tome that basically is sort of like my take on world history, why the British Empire is a lot more powerful than we typically acknowledge, and why the U.S. and British empires are actually much more similar, and why, unfortunately, the United States appears to be making a lot of the same mistakes that the British Empire made. You should check those out. Also, an older thing called FATCA and the New Birth of American Empire. Some stuff that I want to revisit a little bit more recently, because it's sort of an indication that so much of U.S. power is not about the military. It's not even about sanctions. It's about much quieter, more subtle stuff. And FATCA is just one example of those things. All right, well, thank you all for being here. Y'all are the best. I don't think I do make more than U.S. minimum wage, unfortunately. Actually, I might. Yeah, I think I do. Anyway, okay. Thank you all. Y'all are the best, and thank you for being here for 2 hours. You're the greatest. Yeah, thank you. Have a good day.